So welcome to the second part of our lecture on ancient civilizations of the Americas, and we now enter the post-classic period, the first really important civilization, that of the Toltecs, emerging around 900. And this kind of also corresponds to new people migrating into the region from the north, into Mesoamerica. So their capital was Tula, located near the northern periphery of Mesoamerica, probably because it was near a very important source of obsidian. But much of what we know about them really coming from the archaeological record or from what, various understandings of the Toltecs from the Aztec period, right? And here we see some statues. We're pretty sure they correspond to warriors from the Toltec period. And so, the Aztec would connect themselves to the Toltec, right? Later Aztec mythology would actually glorify them as the font of their own civilization. So what do we know about the Toltecs, right? Tula, a very important city, substantial population, between 35 and 60,000 people. We're really not sure whether it was the capital of a proper empire or whether just a very influential political center. They did practice human sacrifice, much as the Aztecs would. And had many of the same deities. And here we see some of the remains from Tula, from the kind of archaeological record there. Now, if we're talking about the post-classic period, by far the most famous civilization in Mesoamerica would be the Aztecs, who refer to themselves as Mexica, hence the name Mexico. And by the time of the Spanish arrival in 1519, they had built up a very complex and extensive empire, and definitely flourishing at that time. But of course, the arrival of the Spanish kind of marking the beginning of the end, inasmuch as the Spanish would very rapidly conquer the Aztec. Having said that, much of what we know about the Aztecs actually coming from the records of their Spanish conquerors. So some things we do know, right? Initially started out as a tribute state of Azcapotzalco, but then eventually was able to consolidate its authority in the region through marriage alliances, later on through conquest, and from a pretty early point, kind of a way of legitimizing their eventual control of the region, would claim to be descended from the Toltecs. Now, a lot of this consolidating of their authority in the region would happen under their fourth ruler, Tezcoatl. In 1428, under him, the Aztecs would form a triple alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, and then together turning against Azcapotzalco to become the dominant power in the Valley of Mexico. And in fact, Itzalcoatl would lay the foundation of Aztec imperial ideology, kind of you might say the kind of political ideology by which they governed. So almost immediately ordering the burning of all ancient books and expunging the history of other peoples that had come into conflict with the Aztec, who might challenge the legitimacy of their rule. And then even restructure the Aztec religion to justify Aztec dominance, right? And really it's at this point that they really began promoting themselves as the divinely ordained successors to the ancient Toltecs. Their capital, what is presently Mexico City, as far as the location, would be Tenochtitlán. And it's literally built on a lake in the Valley of Mexico, which really is actually the crater of a huge volcano. According to legend, the Aztecs were led to an island in Lake Texcoco in 1325 by their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, and that marked the beginning of the establishment of Tenochtitlan. Eventually, the Aztecs would create an empire that pretty much included almost all of what today is central Mexico. And by all accounts, including those of the Spanish, Tenochtitlan was an amazingly beautiful city. The center built in the middle of this lake. And so what eventually emerged is a kind of vast network of canals connecting various points of the city. All of this connected by three great causeways to the mainland, three massive bridges. And then at the very center, dominated by a double temple complex dedicated to their two most important gods, Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlatelolco. In terms of how the Aztec governed subjugated people, usually it was not by direct rule, right? Usually after conquering them, they would leave local elite intact and in power. And there was even kind of a hierarchy in terms of different territories or different cities. Some had a much more favorable position with respect to the Aztecs, with respect to Tenochtitlan. Tlacopan and Texcoco, which had been part of the Triple Alliance, were probably at the very top. And then further down the line, right? I mean, what was mostly required of these subjugated peoples, subjugated territories, was the provision of heavy tribute, inclusive of goods of all kinds, right? So agricultural goods were very important. Jade featured very prominently. We've already seen that jade was a valued mineral by many civilizations in Mesoamerica. And then something kind of unique to the Aztec, precious feathers, right? Because feathers featured very prominently in their religion. So you end up with this, these immense quantities of goods constantly flowing into Tenochtitlan, which also meant a tremendous amount of wealth entering the city, hence why they were able to beautify it to such a great extent, right? Using that revenue to fund public works. And if we made a map of the Aztec Empire, it probably would look something like this. Here, color-coded, each color corresponding to territory that was conquered under a different ruler. I think most people know that human sacrifice featured very prominently within the Aztec religion, and there was a political dimension to it as well. The Aztec believed that their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, who was a sun god, required human blood in order to sustain him in this perpetual battle with the moon and stars. And the Aztecs had a responsibility to provide victims, right? Mostly made up of war captives, and in fact, sometimes they went to war strictly for that purpose, right? In order to acquire more victims. And there were a number of major festivals during which huge numbers of people would be sacrificed, right? It could be up to 1,000 in one go. And according to some of the historical sources, occasionally they would eat parts of the victims, either the limbs or even cutting out hearts, and then eating them in a kind of ritualistic manner. And the human sacrifice is usually one aspect of what were very elaborate religious rituals, very often supposedly recreating almost cosmic battles between gods, wherein the victims were understood as kind of standing in for particular gods who obviously lost the battle, and therefore would be sacrificed kind of at the end of the whole process, right, after a series of ritualistic components. Probably, maybe the most interesting religious ritual involved the choosing of a beautiful male youth to represent the god Tezcatlipoca. This individual would have been chosen pretty much about a year prior to their being sacrificed, during which time they would be treated with tremendous reverence, right? Even the virtual ruler of the city for a few days prior to being sacrificed. It's kind of interesting to try and, imagine what it would have felt like for that individual. Someone raised in that culture with the same religious beliefs. You kind of imagine they would have considered it an honor. I always imagine, they might have started having maybe second thoughts in the few days prior to the actual sacrifice, but that probably reflects more modern day perspective. Now, in terms of how Aztec society was organized, in terms of hierarchy, you could break it down into two broad classes, right? You had nobles and you had commoners. Though you could argue there's kind of an intermediate category of, very well-to-do commoners, prosperous merchants and artisans. And people would indicate which social group they belonged to in terms of what they wore, right? There was kind of a social hierarchical dress code. So if you were wearing brilliant colors, that would pretty much indicate that you were noble. The more simple your garment, the further down in the hierarchy you were as a commoner. And there really was an expectation that people would fulfill their place within the social structure without any complaint, right? Aztecs valued obedience, respectfulness, discipline, and moderation, right? Standards for behavior were more strict the higher up the social order one was, right? Those at the top, in a sense, expected to lead by example. And here we see kind of a visual representation of the Aztec social hierarchy. It's a kind of pyramid. And, it's kind of interesting to think about if we went back to the beginning of the course, looking at where we were looking at ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. In some ways, not that different, right? You have an emperor at the very top, and then right below him, the nobility, also priests, very similar to what we saw in ancient Mesopotamia. Then below that, this kind of, shall we say, the upper crust of commoners, merchants, artisans, also soldiers. So that really is a significant distinction from those commoners below them, which are primarily made up of farmers, fishers, and women, by virtue of their gender, inherently consigned to that particular social category. And then, so that's maybe a bit different from what we saw in Mesopotamia. And then at the very bottom, as has so often been the case throughout history, we have slaves. So looking first at the Aztec nobility, there is even kind of a ranking system within the nobility. The highest ranking members known as Tlatelolco, and these were the rulers of major political units, right? So they had a measure of authority. And of these, the highest would end up being the rulers of the 3 cities of the Triple Alliance, inclusive of Tenochtitlán, right? Which, of course, had the highest position in the hierarchy. Below them were the Tetkutin, lords of subordinate units, and then below them, the Pipiltin, who filled the bureaucratic positions as well as the priesthood. Of course, as has been the case throughout history with regard to almost every civilization we've looked at, the vast majority were commoners, right? Most Aztecs were commoners who either farmed these agricultural plots known as chinampas, usually along the lake shore, or harvested fish or provided basic labor. That made up the majority of commoners. We talked about there being slaves. There is actually a certain degree of movement between the commoners, strata, and slaves, right? Many slaves had started out as commoners who were unable to pay their debts or required tribute, or who had committed crimes, right? So they ended up becoming slaves, or, if they were less fortunate, sold as victims for sacrifice. And some even ended up as serfs who worked for the estates of noblemen, right? Using the term serfs, kind of borrowing it from European feudalism, but in many ways the same basic idea that they ended up being tied to the noblemen's estates. We might also consider Aztec society in terms of how the city, particularly Tenochtitlan, was organized structurally, right? So at the center, and this is, sounds very familiar, kind of like, going all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. At the center, you have the temples, royal place, kind of, the main administrative structures. Once you move away from that, the rest of the city, Tenochtitlan, would have been divided into 4 quarters, with each quarter divided into wards known as calpulli. And each calpulli, in a sense, a kind of self-contained neighborhood, each having its own temple. Each temple would have a songhouse attached to it where the children of commoners received a very basic kind of rudimentary education. Young men would receive their military training in their respective calpulli in what were known as telpucali, or young men's houses. And then, each calpulli would have officials responsible for ensuring that they fulfilled their tribute obligations. And then finally, we talked about how there's this kind of upper crust of commoners made up of merchants and traders. Actually, there's a special term in reference to them, pochteca, and they actually were they played a very important economic role with respect to the empire, particularly in terms of bringing revenue to the center from further abroad. Their activities were secured by the threat of force from Aztec armors. They actually organized their own guilds and established their own laws and customs, so a certain degree of autonomy in that regard. And again, it's largely because of the incredible wealth they generated that they had a lot of influence. They enjoyed a kind of special status, even having their own calpulli, for instance, right? And they, in fairness to them, right, to some degree you could argue they earned this. They were the ones most likely to go furthest afield, heading expeditions that ultimately would bring tremendous wealth back to the center, even while spreading Aztec influence. And finally, before moving on from our discussion of Aztec civilization, we should make mention of the city of Tlatelolco. So Tenochtitlan, by far, the most important city in the Aztec Empire, certainly politically. But Tlatelolco, which wasn't that far away, probably the most important city economically, right? More than 60,000 people visiting it daily. This is where the bulk of economic activity took place, right? You had all the major markets there, corresponding to which market administrators enjoyed a very high status in that city. It's kind of worth noting that women could also be market administrators, with respect to which they could also inherit and own property. Their primary function was to regulate the various transactions that took place there. It's kind of interesting, in order to facilitate economic activity, they even had something approaching a currency wherein they used cocoa beans and cotton cloaks as a medium of exchange. At this point, we turn to developments in the Andean region, and we might start by considering the kind of environment we have there, right? So along the Pacific coast, you have a narrow strip, much of it desert, but across which run river valleys fed by the Andes Mountains. So, those would be more fertile. And then as you move inland, you come into the Andes Mountains, into grasslands, fertile valleys, eventually to the peaks of the mountains, and then coming down the eastern slope, eventually descending into the Amazon basin's tropical rainforests. The earliest people we know about in the Andean region, so this is kind of, the beginning of permanent settlement. We know they cultivated native plants such as the potato, also a grain called quinoa, and corn or maize in the mountain valleys. We also have evidence that they maintain herds of llamas and alpacas in the grasslands, the Puna grasslands, which, and this kind of runs contrary to the general rule with the Americas, that they didn't really have much in the way of domesticated animals that they might use as beasts of burdens or for meat. Well, in this case, they did, right? They used llamas and alpacas in exactly that way. When discussing the development of Andean civilization, historians usually divide it into 7 periods: the pre-ceramic and initial periods, then the early, middle, and late horizons, periods during which we see a kind of homogeneous art style spreading over a wide area, and then finally the early and late intermediate periods, which sees greater regional stylistic diversity. The oldest civilization in the Andean region, and we're using the term civilization here in a very broad way, would be the North Chico civilization. Mostly what we know about them is from the archaeological record. We have evidence of kind of monumental architecture, a number of different sites, probably the most famous of which is Caral. They seem to occupy mostly territory corresponding to modern-day Peru, dating back to the early 3rd millennium BCE, mostly located along the coast, and then kind of fading out around 1800 BCE. There is some consistency, a certain degree of uniformity between these different sites, suggesting they were all part of a coherent civilization, again, using that term in a very kind of rudimentary way. What do we know about them? They subsisted on squash, beans, and chili peppers. This would seem to mark kind of a first attempt at cultivating maize or corn, and obviously will improve in that regard over time. And maybe some very basic manufacturing of cotton fishing nets and other textiles. Nothing overly sophisticated, but maybe marking the beginning of what we might call an Andean textile tradition that eventually will become quite sophisticated. The next major civilizational development taking place during the pre-ceramic period, and we see kind of a shift away from the coastline to the highlands. So the earliest public buildings corresponding to this new civilization dating to just before 2500 BCE, typically stone-walled structures enclosing sunken fire pits, as far as we can tell, used for ritual purposes. Again, a certain degree of uniformity between these different sites that seem to reflect a shared religious tradition, often referred to as the Kotosh religious tradition, but that is a historians or archaeologists' term, right? Kind of a reference to one particular site, the site of Kotosh. And we see continued cultivation of maize, now also the cultivation of potatoes. And by 2500 BCE, llamas and alpacas fully domesticated. That brings us to the initial period, which is marked by the introduction of pottery around 2000 BCE. Evidence that people are becoming more dependent on agriculture and marine resources, meaning they're in a sense becoming even more settled. Settlements now moving inland, some of them becoming larger, some of which we believe were probably ceremonial centers. We see certain developments in terms of engineering, more sophisticated irrigation systems, and finally evidence that society is becoming more stratified, right? Kind of more evidence of social hierarchy and also evidence of conflict. And then finally coming to the early Horizon period, probably the most important site which emerged around 900 BCE in the Highlands would be Chavín de Huantar. And what's kind of interesting with this particular site, right, kind of evidence of greater degree of trade over a greater expanse of territory, right? So we see Chavín de Huantar located along what was apparently a very, very important trade route between the coast and the lowland tropical rainforest, but also a center of a religious cult, the influence of which we find evidence of that throughout Peru, particularly between the years 400 and 200 BCE. Then finally, the Chavín culture collapsing, probably because of increased warfare and regional diversity. So evidence of Chavín de Huantar's influence further afield, perhaps nowhere more evident than in the central temple complex, which perhaps is itself evidence of its religious influence among a broad range of individuals, geographically speaking, right? But what's kind of interesting when you look at the complex, the architecture clearly reflecting coastal influence, but a lot of artistic iconography drawn from tropical forest animals, right, on the other side of the Andean mountains. Also evidence in this temple that they were fairly sophisticated engineering speaking, right? The structure known as the Old Temple had a kind of drainage system that channeled water in order to produce a roaring sound like a jaguar. Right? So that's kind of impressive if you think about it, that they were able to kind of work out how to do that. And then, finally, probably we should note the most famous artifact from this site, the lanzon, a stele carved in the image of the Fang deity, combining human and feline features, right? So, I mean, between the water channel, the drainage system being designed to create the sound of a jaguar, and then the use of feline features, also artistic iconography coming from the tropical forest, which would also feature big cats, clearly very important to their religious system. And now we come to the early intermediate period, probably the most famous civilization, though maybe a better term here might be culture, would be the Nazca. Right, who flourished from about 100 BCE to about 700 CE. Largest site, Cahualchi, likely a religious center, but it may have been the capital of some kind of confederation. We're pretty sure nothing really resembling a proper empire. The Nazca are probably most famous for what are known as geoglyphs. These really immense images drawn into the soil, usually in very arid regions, right? Depicting figures such as hummingbirds, spiders, and killer whales. But I mean, they're really huge, right? So, if you were standing on the ground next to this, you would be a little black dot, right? I mean, if you were standing next to it, there is no way you're able to actually get a sense of what kind of image these lines are creating, right? If you were able to connect them all. You literally would have to be at a high vantage point. In fact, these images most likely taken from an airplane. So this is really something that a lot of people have pondered. First of all, what were the purposes or purpose of these figures? Did they have a religious purpose? Were they there for the gods to look down and see? And how did they actually go about doing this? Right? I mean, it really would be. There's something very impressive that there's no way they could actually. There were no airplanes back then, so, some way they could get kind of a high vantage point to see what it was they were drawing, right? But somehow all the lines coming together quite perfectly. By the way, it's exactly, things like this that lead to the kind of speculation you find, sadly, on the History Channel about alien races visiting humanity. during the period of its early development, right? Like trying to explain how these things came about. If we're talking about the early intermediate period, we should also note the Moche culture, which flourished from about 200 to 77 CE in what today corresponds to northern Peru. Very skilled potters and smiths. Again, not really anything properly resembling an empire, though likely understood as consisting of two kind of, loosely organized kingdoms or realms, a northern realm and a southern realm, with each valley ruled by Moche lords from their own respective centers. So again, most of what we know up until this point from the archaeological record, as far as any of these civilizations / cultures that we've looked at, nothing resembling written records, though that's actually going to kind of be an issue unique to the Andean region right up through the Inca. We'll get to that momentarily. So as far as the Moche culture goes, you have really one prominent archaeological site, likely corresponding to something resembling a city, dominated by two temple-like structures, the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna. Also, in the late 1980s, they found the undisturbed tombs of Moche rulers. So that provided a bit more information, in terms of what we could learn from the archaeological record. So we find evidence of human sacrifice, that perhaps they drank the blood of prisoners, whose flesh was then removed from their bones. All rather gruesome, likely part of, much more complex religious rituals and so forth. That brings us to the middle horizon through the late intermediate period, where we see the emergence for the first time of expansionist empires. One centered in Tiwanaku, in what roughly today corresponds to the state of Bolivia, in the Bolivian High Plain, and then the other at Huari in the south central highlands of Peru. And so now we're starting to see what, to our mind, resemble proper civilizations, right? I mean, still no writing, and again, that's kind of a unique feature of Andean civilizations in general. But in many other respects, right, a kind of certain level of sophistication, politically, socially, in terms of engineering capability that feel more familiar, as somehow constituting civilization. Probably the most interesting and very distinct aspect of these civilizations is what we call Andean verticality, which in many ways define how they were organized politically, but it really had to do with how to best economically exploit your territory, right? Kind of a recognition that you have, because of the Andean mountains, right? Everything depending on altitude, right? You have, the region has kind of varied ecological zones, and so they developed a rather sophisticated understanding of how best to exploit each ecological zone, right? And that would determine the nature of the various settlements that were sent out to different parts of the empire, right? With kind of an eye towards how best to exploit them economically. So looking more closely, right, at these different kind of imperial centers, we have Tiwanaku, which again located in the Bolivian highland, to be more precise, on the south shore of Lake Titicaca, and probably the highest capital in the ancient world at the time, flourishing from about 500 to 1000 CE. Laid out in a grid, it had a population at its height of between 20 and 40,000 people, with an economic base really rooted in this kind of system of raised field agriculture, right? So, really not the most suitable terrain for agriculture, but they developed certain practices that really allow them to nonetheless effectively exploit it. So they would create these kind of artificial platforms on top of which they would put topsoil, right? And these would be separated from one another by basins of water, and all of this being developed along the shores of Lake Titicaca. So just to give you an idea of what it might look like, right? If you were trying to create a kind of cross image of it, right? So you have the platform in the center there. It's an artificial platform. Its base consisting of stone, and then putting soil on top of it that you might then use agriculturally. And again, you have these kind of water basins separating it from other platforms. And then the other imperial center that we talked about associated with the Moche culture or civilization, the city of Huari, which was the capital of a rather sizable empire, flourishing from about 600 to 800 CE, mostly made up of a sprawl of large, high-walled stone enclosures, population comparable to that of Tiwanaku, about 20 to 30,000 people. And once again, though, right, I mean, you had this issue of existing in a terrain not suited to agriculture and developing rather sophisticated practices that allow you to maximize what you can grow there. In this case, techniques involving terracing and the irrigating of the slopes of these intermontane valleys where their empire is located, right? The city of Huari located in one such valley, meaning these valleys surrounded by mountains, again, a terrain not ideally suited to agriculture, but finding a way. Particularly interesting with regard to the Huari Empire is it would seem to have been a very peaceful kind of empire in terms of, they never really had to impose themselves militarily on the various regions that came under its rule. I mean, we can't say we know that for sure, but when we look at the archaeological record, particularly as pertained to the various administrative centers, right, these were undefended. They were built in very accessible places. And this is the kind of thing you wouldn't normally find if there was any chance of some kind of revolt. Also something interesting with the Huari, perhaps the closest we're going to get to proper writing in the Andean region. Huari administrators used what were known as quipu record-keeping devices made of string, very similar to Inca quipu, though they used strings with different colors instead of knots to indicate different values. So primarily for record-keeping. But you can, in a sense, read them, so we could think of them as constituting, in a sense, a kind of language. At some point, Moche authority will collapse, but before we get to the Inca, we will see the emergence of two more states, roughly in the same territory, corresponding to the ones we just looked at. One is named after the primary site, corresponding to it, of Sican, in the Lambayeque Valley. The central figure there, referred to as the Sican Lord, supposedly representing a mythical founder figure named Naimlap. And probably more important would be the Chimu Empire, centered in the Moche Valley, which would expand in two waves to create an empire that would eventually incorporate the Lambayeque Valley and would actually stretch for about 800 miles along the coast. Chimu Empire finally coming to an end in 1470 when it was incorporated into the Inca Empire. But before we get to the Inca, we might very briefly make note of the administrative capital of the Chimu Empire, Chanchan, located in the center of the Moche Valley. And it was, pretty impressive as cities during that period go, about 8 square miles in size. At the center of the city were found 10 immense adobe-walled enclosures, referred to as ciudadelas, likely housing the ruling elite. And, population roughly the kind of numbers we've been looking at for some time up until this point chronologically, population between 30 and 40,000. And that finally brings us to the Inca Empire, which most of you I'm sure have heard of, the largest state ever in the pre-Columbian Americas, right? So kind of a long, narrow strip running between the Pacific coast and the Amazon basin. But beginning at its greatest extent, beginning in northern Chile and running all the way up to the southern part of present-day Colombia, and encompassing a very ethnically and linguistically diverse population of peoples numbering the millions. One of the most impressive things about the Inca, and one of many indications of just how sophisticated civilization it was, all of these settlements were very well connected through an excellent network of roads, right? Very often roads that were having to traverse very difficult terrain. Unlike the Maya and the Aztecs, however, and much in line with the Andean cultures that we've looked at until now, they would lack an alphabet-based writing. The Inca referred to their empire as Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, and the capital Cusco lay at the intersection of these divisions and was the home to the ruler known as the Inca and the ruling elite. And by all accounts, a beautiful city. Its principal temples dedicated to the sun and the moon, supposedly gleaming with gold and silver, and the city's boundaries were drawn to resemble the shape of a puma. Now, according to legend, I mean, in a sense, how the Inca understood their own history, the expansion of their empire began in the 15th century following a revolt by the Chanca people, which the Inca Yupanqui was able to suppress, after which, according to the legend, he assumed the name Pachacuti and laid the foundation for an Inca state that would eventually bring most of the region under his control. Most historians feel that Inca expansion was probably well underway even before this, and involved a number of different mechanisms, right? Sometimes the formation of alliances, sometimes just through intimidation. Certain peoples might acquiesce to Inca rule, and, of course, through conquest. So as the Inca built up their empire, they organized it into a hierarchical administrative structure using their own language, Quechua, as an administrative one. Succession, very interestingly, determined through a consultative process, right? With a royal family member who was judged the most capable, generally being chosen. And on the face of it, that sounds like a pretty good idea, and probably for the most part it was, right? Like you would get somebody actually capable of governing, ruling the empire, but it did sometimes lead to disputes, and that could be a cause for at least temporary instability. One very important practice of the Inca, both religiously and to some degree politically, was ancestor worship. The Inca deeply honored their ancestors. Mummified bodies of ancestors were preserved. This was especially common among the elite. In terms of it having kind of a political dimension to it, with respect to the emperor, right? The mummified bodies of dead emperors provided with food, but more importantly, brought out to view on important occasions, right? So kind of having a state level function. And this also becomes relevant with respect to the inheritance of property, right? So the idea that property is inherited by descendants communally, right? Kind of inherited by the living descendants within a family. And that also had kind of a significance at the state level. The property of a deceased emperor was inherited by his descendants, a group known as a panaca, not his successor. And at the time of the Spanish conquest, you had 11 of these elite groups. So when a new emperor took power, they needed to undertake military expansion in order to provide property for their own descendants. They wouldn't really be inheriting anything as individuals. So the Inca were strongly hierarchical in terms of how their society was structured, also in terms of how they administered their empire, and their religion was also hierarchical in terms of the gods they worship. So the main ritual associated with Inca religion, apart from ancestor worship, would be the sacrificing of animals to their gods. And if there were a crisis of human beings, though here, usually it would be children. Outside the major population centers, most people practice a folk religion based on spirits rather than formal gods. Just by the by, the most important Inca god, known as Inti. In terms of how things functioned economically, very important was the mita, a labor taxation system whereby subjects of the Inca had to devote a certain amount of their labor to designated projects, right? So a lot of this would obviously be agricultural. Agricultural land was divided in several categories, some of which were reserved for the state and the gods, right? And that's where you might have your own plot that you worked on to produce food for yourself and your family, but you also had to devote a certain amount of time to working on agricultural land for the state or in the service of the gods. Local people worked for the state on a regular basis. Very often they got something in return. So it wasn't exactly free labor. They received gifts and state-sponsored ritual entertainments. And this kind of system also applied to the army. Men had to serve in the army, very often on vast public works. Sometimes, rather than the mita functioning on an individual level, it might incorporate entire communities, what was known as a mita mak, whereby the whole community was devoted to a particular public work, for instance, or military service. One special use of the mita was where a loyal community was compelled to settle in a hostile region, right? It might be a region recently conquered, so this would be a way of kind of consolidating Inca control. But in any event, right, once a local people were relocated to a new unfamiliar province, their chief objects of worship were relocated to the capital of Cusco, where they were attended to by representatives of that community, right, of its original worshippers. So this kind of maintained a connection between this newly settled population and the capital of Cusco. And also there was a kind of rotation involved, like the individuals representing that community would actually change from time to time. And one, kind of side benefit of this was that the transferred population, through this kind of arrangement, became familiar with the language and customs of the core city of Cusco. Right? So if you think about it, also kind of way of disconnecting them with whatever region they originally came from, and kind of strengthening their bond with the Inca, with the capital city, and in that way kind of incorporating them into the empire. One really interesting aspect of Inca society and kind of unique to them was the employment of women as priestesses known as virgins of the sun, or mamakuna. So these women would live very privileged, albeit celibate, and highly regulated lives in the cities and towns. And sometimes they actually were deployed in a political way. They might be given in marriage by Inca rulers to cement alliances, and they had certain special functions with respect to the Inca elites, such as weaving and the brewing of maize beer, this maize beer known as chicha. And here we see an artistic depiction of the Virgins of the Sun engaging in some kind of religious ritual. Finally, just kind of wrapping things up, we should make mention of textiles at which the Inca were very adept in producing. It was actually a very important source of wealth and prestige, cloth and clothing. And so they're kind of famous for developing these very complex textile patterns. And, the different patterns would signify social status, a person's rank, even one's ethnic affiliation. Which, if you think about it, in a society where hierarchy really matters, knowing your place matters, this would really help people to navigate interactions with other people, right? Like just by looking at what they were wearing, you'd have a pretty good idea of, who they were relative to you in terms of status, where they came from, and so forth, and then how to engage them. Textile production was a form of labor service. Inca warehouses were filled with textiles along with other goods. And so in the production, you had full-time state workers, yanakuna. They tended to the royal llama herds, right? So in a sense, a kind of palace-controlled industry, though, also textile production taking place at various levels of society, including within families. And finally, Inca administration, if we're thinking about the empire as a whole, each region had its own administrative center, also warehouses, so effectively functioning as distribution centers for food and goods. And this is, again, where this, excellent network of roads really came into play. The wealth of the empire is what sustained the whole mita system, as well as the army, even while, of course, enriching the Inca elite. I mean, that's the whole point of being elite, right? That you enjoy, among other things, not just status, but wealth. And finally, as we noted, throughout our discussion of Andean cultures and civilizations, the Inca, as their predecessors, did not have any writing, but they did keep detailed administrative records on string accounting devices known as quipu, right? So we've already encountered this, shall we say, form of writing. Again, is something in a sense that you can engage as a text, but not writing in the conventional sense. And one last stop before we go, because how could we have a lecture about the Inca without having at least one slide showing Machu Picchu, probably the most famous archaeological site associated with the Inca. Somewhat ironically, because not a particularly important site politically or religiously, effectively, a citadel, probably an estate for the Emperor Pachacuti. Why is it so famous? It's a beautiful location. There's kind of, a whole exotic story behind it. apart from, probably local people, not really known until the beginning of the 20th century, because very well hidden in a sense in the upper reaches of the mountains. And, no doubt the view is fantastic. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you do have the chance to go to Peru, you should visit Machu Picchu. In any event, that concludes our final lecture. And as usual, please make sure to respond to the lecture-based questions in the discussion forum created for that purpose.